Hey, how's it? I'm Dan. Welcome back to Breathing Underwater's Moviecast. On episode 20 of this podcast, my best friend Jason and I sat down and talked about what we call the Ouroboros franchises, the ones that are just cannibalizing themselves at this point with nothing new to say or offer. And we covered things like Star Wars and Terminator and Jurassic Park and Harry Potter even. But one big one that I totally overlooked was Lord of the Rings. So quick context and history about Lord of the Rings for me personally is that, as far as I can remember, my parents always had the books around, at least The Hobbit, if not the trilogy. I remember seeing the animated versions on the shelves in Blockbuster, and by middle school, my brother got really into it, especially with the advent of us playing a lot of Japanese role-playing games that were obviously very heavily influenced by the open world traveling and adventures found in Tolkien's works. So as a younger kid, I was definitely familiar. I knew who Frodo was, I knew there was a Ring of Power, I knew there were dragons and dwarves and elves, but I never made the effort to actually sit down and read the books. So my real entry point, which probably for millions and millions of other people like me and generations after, it was all the buzz and hype around going to see Fellowship the first time. And after seeing it, then I was hooked. Then I was in. That also happened to come out, though, as I was transitioning into film school. And so The Two Towers and Return of the King came out while I was actively studying film at the University of the Arts in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, which you can hear more about on episode 23 of this podcast, where I talked to a current film student about her experience in film school decades after mine. But I don't think there could have been a better timing for me to have discovered a passion for Tolkien's work and Peter Jackson's work, because I was kind of like at the height or the peak of my more scrutinizing interest in the behind the scenes craft of making movies. And I'm sure it's totally common knowledge, but since DVDs are kind of passé at this point, and I'm not a Blu-ray or 4K collector, so I'm not sure what's on the bonus features of those, though I would hope and assume they're on there. When the DVDs were released originally for the extended editions of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, each included a 6-hour behind-the-scene documentary meticulously, painstakingly detailing every step of the process of making those movies and the craft behind it. So the movies themselves, but also the making of content, was almost just as impactful for me at the time, because that's what I was focused on and studying. So after I was hooked on the world, after seeing Fellowship in the early 2000s, and while the other movies were being released, I don't remember the exact time frame, but I did read all the books, including The Hobbit, though I still didn't go too deep into things. I never read the Silmarillion, mostly because people kept telling me that it's really dry and boring. And I am admittedly more of a story conflict engager than just a lore kind of engager, and I think that makes sense of why I wasn't interested in reading the books back in high school, because Tolkien's writing and the lore itself wasn't enough for me to really want to dig into it. It was the characters like Frodo and Aragorn and Éowyn that really drew me in, and then made me more interested to learn about the wider lore and the context and the world building around those characters. So all that is to say that, number one, I love Tolkien and Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings trilogy, even though I didn't get really into it until a little bit later than my foundational years, while I was getting into things like Jurassic Park and Terminator and Back to the Future and Star Wars. So I wouldn't really call it like a childhood passion like it was for my brother. It's definitely up there in that same echelon. I highly respect and admire Tolkien's work, the world and the characters that he created, and how much he inspired generations of fantasy lovers and storytellers and people like Peter Jackson and his team to make such colossally both terrific and successful adaptations of his work. So for no particular specific reason that I can recall, a few years ago my wife and I started a tradition where we would watch the Lord of the Rings trilogy around Christmas time. And before that, I intentionally hadn't watched them for a while because I'd seen them so many times. Like that scene in Clerks 2.
How many times?
Well, 3 for Fellowship, 2 for Towers, 4 for Return.
5 for Return.
Dude.
I'm pretty sure I saw Fellowship at least twice in the theater, Two Towers at least 3 times, and then Return of the King 5.
Dude.
And that was just while they were in theaters. And then when I got the DVDs, I watched them repeatedly. So just like the original Star Wars trilogy,
There's only one return, okay? And it ain't of the king, it's of the Jedi.
sometimes I need intentional breaks so it doesn't lose all the magic. So I can return to it every once in a while with a little bit of a fresh perspective and anticipation. But after seeing the original trilogy when it was originally released, some parts of the narrative stood out to me as somewhat unsatisfying. And now, after the past few years of rewatching watching the movies together, it's only been reinforced to me that Tolkien's work, of course, because he was not as character focused as he was world building and lore building and linguistic building focused. So his characters were more archetypal. And though Jackson and his writing team did take a good amount of liberties in their adaptation process to make them more cinematically and narratively three-dimensional and well-rounded and developed, I still feel that walking that line that Jackson was trying to walk of being as faithful as possible still left some room for improvement. So though I love both the original trilogy of books and movies of the Lord of the Rings series, as blasphemous as it might be to say, neither are perfect, nor should any story created by people be, because if it was, then it would be unengaging and not human. So speaking of plugging other episodes of this podcast, on episode 24, where I critique but also offer some rewrite ideas were I to have been included in the writing process of Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny. But what inspired that specific episode and idea was a class that I took while studying film in college, where we would take what we considered to be a lackluster or otherwise a script with more potential than the ultimate output of it had. And we were given the opportunity to rewrite it and look at it more from a script doctor kind of point of view. And another class that is relevant to what this episode is going to be about is a class that was specific about adaptation, where we would read a novel and then watch and study the film, compare and contrast and critique and do our own rewrites of the adaptation of that book to film. Now, I just want to say again that I love Tolkien's books and I adore the films. And I know, who am I to say what should and shouldn't have happened in the adaptation process for these? Jackson had a vision and he brought it to life almost immaculately, and it's amazing that he was able to, especially in the system that he was working in. I really think that The Lord of the Rings was like one of the last great examples of sort of old Hollywood ways of doing things, where the production team was allowed to do what they were passionate about without a lot of interference, especially at that scale. And we got some of the most brilliant and epic and timeless, and what I would argue is maybe the best film trilogy ever, because of that freedom and that trust that they gave Jackson and his team. So this episode is not at all meant to be a critique or a criticism or like a smug, pretentious, oh, I could have done better, as provocative as the title of this episode might imply. For me, this is more harkening back to like those classes that I took, like 20 years ago now. It's an exercise in growing and refining my own understanding of the craft of story and the adaptation process. So if you want to find and yell at me about how wrong I am for even considering doing an episode like this, you can find me at breathingunderwater.us. But please understand, this is out of love and reverence, and it's just my own multiversal, alternate reality, fan fiction version of what could have been. And again, for any Tolkien purist, this really isn't about Tolkien. This is about Jackson and his writing team and looking at what they did. Though again, just to be clear, I totally understand, respect, and agree with Jackson's vision for these movies, which was to bring Tolkien's works to life as close to the books as possible, while changing as little as possible, while also making the story and characters as accessible to mainstream global audiences as possible. So there's a lot to juggle there. I think what he did was near perfection, and he made obviously something, like I said, a classic, timeless, super successful version. So there's no decrying any of that. However, there was a couple things that always really stood out to me about things that were set up or implied in both Tolkien and Jackson's narrative that I just felt never really hit home, or always a little unsatisfying and a little bit of loose threads. Number one, from the beginning, I've always been just a little unfulfilled by Aragorn's only real conflict of becoming king is his own reluctance and fear, the whole reluctant hero or reluctant leader kind of story, which is fine. It's great. It's just that the climax and the payoff to it I always felt was a little too easy for him. Because in the end, he gets the throne because not he, but Gandalf kills Denethor, and Faramir isn't even there because he's, down and out because of his father sending him back to the overrun Osgiliath. Faramir is set up as such an important and integral character to the story, and then for the climax of the story, he's not even present. And then Faramir, who was the rightful heir to the stewardship, is not even mentioned during the transition of power. Gandalf puts the Gondorian crown on Aragorn's head, and Faramir is just standing there with Éowyn. It was just such an epic conclusion to a huge epic story that I feel like the climax could have had a little bit more of an epic character arc and then stakes for that arc, since Aragorn is one of the top main characters of the story. Now, this relates to the other big issue of the climax that I am sure has been talked about to death already, but I'm going to give my own spin to it in a second, which is the whole plot device of the dead army, the men of Dunharrow. It took me a while to even really understand why Jackson shot and then included in the extended edition the whole scene where Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli are doused with like a waterfall of skulls and they have to like prove themselves worthy. For a long time that always felt pretty superfluous to me, and I see why they cut it out, but now I understand that it was all to visualize Aragorn having to overcome some kind of obstacle put forth to him by the King of the Dead. And I'm probably going to botch the pronunciation here, but Andúril, the Flame of the West, proves his lineage, being a Isildur's heir and being worthy of being the king of Gondor and everything. I get that about it. But then to include the dead army, it's one of the best, and I might argue worst, examples of a Deus Ex Machina, to literally ride in and save the day when it seems like all hope is otherwise lost. But even more so, the whole logistics, starting with Aragorn having to overcome his little test by them and then bringing them to the battlefield. A lot of it just felt a little too easy, really not set up very much, and more importantly, thematically not set up or fully realized or paid off by the end. And the other part to this is that having the Ghost Army ride in and save the day at the end, to me, really negates the stakes and the tension and the underdog status of both Rohan and Gondor's fight against Mordor, when after all the build-up, sacrifice, setbacks, and overcoming insurmountable obstacles on their own, showing men as being worthy of being, the dominant people in Middle-earth, which is kind of what like the whole story has been leading up to. The dead army just comes in and, puts both Gondor and Rohan to shame. Lastly, when it comes to the Dunharrow, they're really barely even characters. There's almost no characterization or development. So personally, I just never found them very interesting or relatable. They really came across as more of just a plot device. And again, I understand, and I agree with Jackson's reason for including them and having things play out the way they did with them, because that's how it was in the books. But as I've learned both in film school and just from my own experience, both as an audience member and consumer of story and lover of film and story in general, but also somebody interested in telling his own stories, the golden rule of adaptation to me is, or should be, do what is best for the story, the characters, and the overall experience of the story or the film. And that's why for this, call it what you want, fan fiction, thought experiment, I'm going to try to put all these things together, my very minor gripes with the adaptation, my schooling and experience as a writer, and I'm going to pretend that, like I said, in an alternate reality, I was part of Peter Jackson's writing team in the late 90s after New Line greenlit making all 3 films, because I'm sure you've heard that originally they were shopping around a condensed version spanning only 2 films, and New Line said, no, it's gotta be all 3. And the other part of this imaginary scenario is that as part of the writing team, we were tasked with, or had a slightly different vision to, not make arbitrary changes just to change stuff, which never makes sense to me. The perfect and worst example being M. Night Shyamalan's Last Airbender adaptation. Why? But instead, to take Tolkien's original vision and work and strengthen the overall narrative, no matter what that meant for the final product, especially when it comes to the characters, to make their journey and the experience of the movie as emotionally impactful and satisfying as possible. That is our goal in this scenario. And you know what? They did this already, as it stands, with Frodo's story, which they expanded on pretty significantly, and because of which, it's vastly more emotionally deep and raw and cinematic than it was in the books. So I'm just going to do the same for Aragorn, because Aragorn's the GOAT, and to me, he's arguably the other main protagonist of the story beside the Frodo-Sam duo. Now, this is going to be unique for me, because if you've heard any of my podcasts before, I just like to do a casual off-the-cuff stream of consciousness discussion. But the more I thought about this one, to just kind of go point by point didn't feel as fun or engaging as putting it into more of a story form. And I thought it would be a good exercise for me anyway. But before we get into it, I also just want to point out that when it comes to the setup of all this, it's already there. The pieces, and that pun will make sense in a minute, are already in the first two films. I wouldn't change any of that. It's actually all perfect setup for where I'm about to go with this. I'm not going to recount every plot and character beat that happened before or during what I'm about to go over. I'm just going to present the changes and or additions that I'm making to what's already in the films. So if I'm leaving out anything, like Frodo and Sam, that's all still intact. So, without further ado, here's how I would adapt Aragorn's story. The Fellowship of the Ring, the Two Towers, and more or less the first half of Return of the King stays exactly as is. We pick up as Faramir enters the walls of Minas Tirith, being dragged by his horse after retreating from the orc invasion of Osgiliath. It's Gandalf and Pippin who find him just after entering the gates, and they're able to bring him around enough so he can accompany them to the White Tower to report to Denethor. As their conversation culminates, with Denethor admonishing Faramir for allowing Frodo to take the Ring of Power to Mordor, Gandalf suggests that the kind of power needed to stop Sauron is not the dark, malicious power that the ring bestows, but the stronger and purer power of hope. Hope can be restored to the world of men, if men united. Faramir, having been a pupil of Gandalf's, considers this, but Denethor thunders his distaste and distrust of non-Gondorians, especially Rohan, who he's never been able to rely on, has never trusted. Meanwhile, at Rohan's camp at Dunharrow, where the Rohirrim gather to assist Gondor in Mordor's impending attack, Elrond arrives to deliver Andúril, reforged from the shards of Narsil, to Aragorn. He urges Aragorn to take the Dimalt Road through the mountains to call upon the oath of the dead men of Dunharrow. Aragorn is doubtful and hesitant that this is the best path to take, that he would even be worthy of presenting the sword of Isildur to the men under the mountain, that they would accept his lineage, so he decides to sleep on it and come to a decision in the morning. However, he wakes from an unrestful sleep to find the sword is missing from his tent. He finds in the nearby passage to the Dimalt Road, a ghostly Dunharrow messenger appears to inform Aragorn that it was a mistake to bring Narsil here, that his people confiscated the reforged sword because no one living is worthy of wielding it. With that, the apparition disappears. This is just a push that Aragorn needs to prove his worth as a leader of Gondor, a leader of men. So he rushes off to retrieve the sword, with Gimli and Legolas in tow, of course, making the Rohirrim believe that they've abandoned them, that they've abandoned hope. As the Rohirrim ride off for Gondor, Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli find themselves in the Paths of the Dead and confront the Dunharrow, where Aragorn defeats the King of the Dead in battle, reclaiming the sword from him, declaring it reforged as Andúril. This proves to the Dunharrow that Aragorn is truly Isildur's heir, and he calls upon them to fulfill their oath to Isildur by helping them defeat Sauron and the armies of Mordor. But, due to the conditions of their curse, they are unable to leave the mountains. Though the King of the Dead sees the same fear and weakness in Aragorn that he saw in Isildur and in himself, which is why he ultimately betrayed Isildur all those years ago and received this curse, he also sees strength and resolve in Aragorn, which makes him see that Aragorn does have the potential to unite the world of men, which the King of the Dead admits he fractured so long ago. He accepts his fate to be eternally cursed for his mistakes, but urges Aragorn not to make the same mistakes and instead go forward as the beacon of hope that the splintered world of men needs at this dark hour. Because of this insight and inspiration, Aragorn decides to then and there fulfill the oath of the Dunharrow, allowing them to pass on in peace. Meanwhile, at Minas Tirith, the battle for Gondor rages. Even with Rohan's mighty appearance just in the nick of time, the odds seem just too stacked against the men on the field to withstand the sheer numbers of Mordor and their allies and their malevolent beasts. Éomer expresses to Theoden that the Gondorian army could tip the scales back in their favor if only they weren't cowardly hiding behind the walls of Minas Tirith. Theoden agrees logistically, but remorsefully admits that it's not cowardice that keeps him at bay, but instead the divisions built between their kingdoms over generations. Divisions that Theoden could have helped rebuild if not for his pride and his hubris. He sees now that men may not be worthy to continue on since they gave up hope on one another long ago. But nearby, at the Osgiliath harbor, where the orcs are mocking the seafaring corsairs of Umbar for being late as usual pirate scum, we see that Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli have concealed themselves in pirate garb aboard a ship. It unloads and the hordes of pirates rush towards the battle. But just before they engage with the Rohirrim, the trio reveals themselves and slows the pirates' advance. As Aragorn surveys the dire situation on the battlefield, he tells his companions to continue holding the line and assisting the Rohirrim while he makes a break for the city to find Denethor and get the Gondorian army out here to help. Inside the walls of the city, as the orcs and the Black Riders threaten to overtake the city from the inside, Gandalf gets separated from Pippin and Faramir, already injured from his failed siege of Osgiliath, is bested by an overwhelming number of orcs while trying to protect Pippin, not unlike his brother Boromir had done. Gandalf reappears and, throwing Faramir on horseback, commands Pippin to take him to the White Tower for help, while he holds off this horde of orcs. But when Pippin brings Faramir to Denethor in the White Tower, he's horrified to find that though Faramir is unconscious, he is still breathing, but Denethor, who's succumbing to madness, believes Faramir to be dead, and with that, he assumes his family lineage and their stewardship of the throne to be over. He commands his aides to begin building a funeral pyre. Pippin pleads with him to see reason, but he has Pippin thrown out of the White Tower. Pippin runs wildly through the streets of the city, looking for Gandalf. Instead, he runs headfirst into Aragorn, explaining the situation in the White Tower, and they rush off. Back in the White Tower above, Faramir begins to rouse as Denethor pours oil over him. But just before Denethor can light the pyre, Aragorn and Pippin burst in. Faramir awakens to find Denethor spewing madness and vitriol at Aragorn. Suspicions about how Aragorn is here to usurp the throne, how he's actually an agent of Sauron's. Denethor unsheaths his sword, and with a torch in his other hand, wildly rushes at Aragorn, who has no choice but to defend himself, though he parries in defense, trying to talk sense into Denethor, that they are wasting time as a world of men falls to Sauron's armies outside their walls. Behind them, Faramir rises from the pyre and draws his sword, demanding that Aragorn cease his attack on his father. Denethor turns to see another vision of Boromir in place of Faramir, and begs him to save Gondor from these unworthy fools. Faramir jumps at Aragorn, and the two brutally duel, while Pippin watches in horror, and Denethor watches in odd delusion at what he thinks is Boromir defending him. During their fight, Aragorn and Faramir exchange justifications about the situation. Aragorn tells of Isildur's reforged sword that helped him prove his lineage to the Dunharrow, and how, despite his fear and reservations, he now understands that coming together to fight evil is the only way to defeat it. But Faramir, finally getting lifelong craved validation and encouragement from his father, and also dazed and in shock from his injuries, fights with blind rage, shouting about how untrustworthy Aragorn is for only happening to show up to claim the throne now, when Sauron is at their doorstep. And even if he's not in league with Sauron, he just helped lead Rohan into battle at Helm's Deep, and the stewards of Gondor have never trusted those allied with Rohan. In addition to all of that, he suspects that Aragorn murdered Boromir with intentions of doing the same to himself and Denethor, so that there would be no opposition to claiming the throne. Why else would he be here now, other than to take advantage of Gondor being at its most vulnerable? This prompts Aragorn to drop his sword and stand down, telling Faramir that if the only way to prove his loyalty to Gondor is to sacrifice himself for it, then so be it. This gives Faramir a pause, but with an encouraging look from Denethor, Faramir begins to swing his sword towards Aragorn's heart. But Gandalf suddenly barges in, startling everyone. Assessing the situation, Gandalf shouts Faramir's name with a deluge of reproach. Faramir hangs his head in disgust with himself and tosses his sword to the side. In a moment of enraged clarity, where Denethor sees the scene before him as it is. He bellows that if his only remaining son is unwilling to protect Gondor from these insidious thieves, then he must. And with that, he clumsily swings his sword at an unawares Pippin, who happens to be in arm reach. But in a flash, Aragorn and Faramir share a meaningful look. Aragorn retrieves Andúril, tossing it to Faramir, who then launches it at Denethor's chest just before his blade makes contact with Pippin. Still with both his sword and torch in hand, Denethor reels back against a freshly oiled pyre, and it ignites around him. Faramir rushes over, but is too late. The flames take hold of his oily clothing. Faramir expresses sorrow for it coming to this, but as he rises from the pyre, Denethor says softly that perhaps Faramir does have the makings of a leader in him after all. Then, as the flames consume him, Denethor rushes from the room, falling off the White Tower to his doom. Back inside the tower, Faramir reverently hands Andúril back to Aragorn, who pleads with Faramir as Gondor's steward to rally Gondor's armies to the battlefield before it's too late. With a heavy expression, Faramir admits that the stewardship ended with his father. He never wanted that role, but with a renewed look of hope and resolve, and a hand on Aragorn's shoulder, Faramir states that he will follow his king to whatever end is commanded. Aragorn reciprocates a hand on Faramir's shoulder. Pippin joins him by their side, unsheathing his sword, and Gandalf gives them all a look of pride. Lower down in the streets of the city, and on the battlefield out front, both the Gondorian soldiers and Rohirrim are all but overrun by orcs and their creatures. The orcs and evil men seem to already be celebrating their victory. All hope appears to be lost. But then, with yet unseen ferocity and power, Faramir and Aragorn ride side by side on horseback through the streets of Minas Tirith, helping their brethren overcome their foes and gathering more and more troops and momentum until they burst out of the front gates in a horde of fury that sends the same wave of shock and terror through the orcs Haradrim and Cossirs of Umbar experienced with the onslaught of the Rohirrim. The Rohirrim meet their kin in battle and drive their foes back to Mordor. Later, after Aragorn and Faramir both rallied the troops of Gondor and Rohan and fought side by side as brothers in front of the Black Gate to create a diversion for Frodo and Sam to accomplish their mission on Mount Doom, Aragorn's coronation is overseen by Faramir, who officially and publicly relinquishes Gondor's throne to Aragorn by placing the Gondorian king's crown on Aragorn's head. They stand together to declare that all men are now united, where they will go forward with hope and peace. So that's what I got. I've been stewing on that for a really long time, and I finally decided to just sit down and write it down. And I hope you enjoyed it. I also hope that the story speaks for itself. But just to clarify why I made those specific changes and additions that I did, to me, the whole overarching theme of the story is overcoming darkness via hope. It's visualized all throughout the trilogy by the main characters uniting and trusting in one another, overcoming differences and never giving up. All of that is amazingly set up and explored throughout the 3 films. But I feel that this rewrite brings that theme to a more satisfying emotional climax for the specific characters, while otherwise, like I alluded to earlier, instead of the dead army negating the main characters of having to overcome the greatest challenges together because they do it for them, this version puts all of that back on our main characters and reinforces that the world of men is worthy to have this power and stewardship over Middle-earth. Even though I didn't mention Éowyn, I think there was the potential to be a really interesting parallel between her relationship with Theoden that could have been mirrored more between Faramir and Denethor. Because yes, Éowyn is also sidelined during her big potential climax in the Two Towers. She does get that climax with Theoden on the Gondorian battlefield, where her kind of sense of self and her place in the world is something that she struggles with throughout the Two Towers and Return of the King, where she defeats the Witch King in front of Theoden, and Theoden finally is able to see her for who she really wants to be, what her potential is, instead of what their society and everything dictates for her. Faramir and Denethor had a very similar kind of dynamic, but even more precarious because, unlike Éowyn, Faramir didn't want any of that kind of power and responsibility, but he was willing to take it on for his people and for his father. So like Éowyn, he was also struggling with his identity and place in the world. Those relationships are kind of like two sides of the same coin. But it was unfortunate to me that, with the exception of just a look between them before Denethor is completely incinerated, he and Faramir really never get that same kind of closure that Éowyn and Theoden did. So in my version, they do. Now, speaking of Faramir and Éowyn, I know there's a whole subplot that I didn't touch on at all, but really neither did the movie. Yes, the extended edition had a moment between them in the Houses of Healing, and in both versions, the theatrical and the extended edition, we see them standing side by side at Aragorn's coronation, but there's really nothing done with it, though I know that to the wider lore and the continuing story, their relationship is really important. So even though I don't have Faramir going to the Houses of Healing right away, I think that whole thing could still play out in my version and remain intact after the Battle of Gondor and the Battle of the Black Gate. Éowyn and Faramir would go to the Houses of Healing still. So like I said before, this episode is a little bit different than anything I've done before on here, and I really appreciate you checking it out. I'd love to know your thoughts. Not just on the specific adaptation points that I covered, but anything else about The Lord of the Rings or anything in any other story that you love that you would still like to alter to make it even better, at least to you and your experience. So check out breathingunderwater.us and let me know your thoughts. And because the road goes ever on, I'll see you next time.